We will go ahead and start. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vishwanath. I'm one of the two co-directors of the Lee Kumshung Center for Health and Happiness here at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to today's webinar from Dr. Amy Orben. Dr. Orben is a group leader of Medical Research Council, Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit at the University of Cambridge. She leads a research group investigating the links between digital technology use, mental health, and cognition in adolescence. Alongside her research, Dr. Orben campaigns for the adoption of more transparent and open scientific practices. Before joining University of Cambridge, she earned a DPhil in experimental psychology at the University of Oxford, for which she was awarded the British Psychological Society Award for Outstanding Contributions to Doctoral Research and an MA in Natural Sciences at the University of Cambridge. So today, she will talk about her work about applying developmental cognitive neuroscience to understand adolescent social media use and mental health, pipe dream or near reality. Her work has attracted a lot of attention, both from scholars and the press, and she's also an advisor. Her advice is sought by policymakers too. So I'm delighted that we can have Dr. Amy Orben with us. This seminar is a part of the Social Media, Wellbeing and Health mini-series at the Lee Kumshung Center for Health and Happiness. So for future events, visit the upcoming events page of our website. Melia will put the link in the chat. We'll continue to update the page as the events are announced. For other opportunities with the center, please subscribe to our mailing list. Again, you will find a link in the chat from Melia. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We are monitoring the chat box for the questions, and I will ask them on your behalf. So again, once again, let me welcome Dr. Amy Orben. Amy, thank you so much for doing this with us. Welcome to the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. I was in the other Cambridge just last week, so I'll just imagine myself being there. So yes, thank you so much for having me. I will be talking a bit about my past, present, and future work today, and hopefully sharing with you some perspectives about why I did the research that I have done, but why I think we need a different way of approaching social media use and well-being to actually provide a positive impact for especially young people now, and to answer the sort of policy and regulatory questions that we're being asked by people like the US Surgeon General or the chief medical officers in the UK. So when I was writing this talk initially on my flight to Boston, I wanted to give a more broader understanding of why this area is so difficult to work on. And I'll actually start at the very beginning. So a lot of us can remember our first social media profile and that first time we entered into this new era of social media. And for me, that was this site. It was called SchülerVZ. I was living in Germany at the time. And SchülerVZ was a blatant ripoff of Facebook with the worst color scheme, horrendously pink. But you could put in, your profile. You'd say where when you were born, where you were living, what school you go to, and a bit of a description about yourself, like your favorite subject at school. And then you could link up with other students. And this really took everyone, it spread like wildfire. And after a couple of months, actually, we all migrated over to Facebook. And I still remember using the school computer labs to do quizzes about what Disney princess you were to add to your profile. This was way before the timeline feature, which I also remember being rolled out with great disdain by my other kind of schoolmates. When I was on the flight and getting ever more tired, I thought I'd actually go through my pictures and see what I could find. And I could find one of my first profile pictures. Yeah, this was young me without glasses, sadly. So what I want to show here is that social media has been around for quite a while, and it started changing lives, you know, over the last 20 or so years. When I went to university, social media was now everywhere. We would take little digital cameras into clubs and take pictures and then upload every single picture online the next day and look through what other people were doing to understand who, you know, where our social group was, who was meeting with whom, what they were doing, and to maybe monitor the social groups we want to be part of. Due to a lot of random kind of happenings, I ended up being allocated my last choice undergraduate project. I was the only person in my year group in psychology at Cambridge to have that privilege. And I was analyzing data from Facebook, a secondary data set. And I was amazed, as somebody who'd used social media for at least some of my teenage life, how little people knew who were doing research on these platforms. For example, there was a common trope that young people were using social media to meet people they didn't know in offline life, which I felt was a gross misrepresentation of what most of social media was about, which was meeting people that you already knew. I ended up accepting to do a PhD at the University of Oxford, trying to really understand some of how social media was changing our social relationships. This was way before Trump or Brexit, and social media wasn't really on a lot of people's horizon, at least in psychology where I worked. And I was really interested in how information transfer might differ for now that we're online. And for example, I could disclose something to many people at once. This really challenged some of the core theories of psychology of how we build relationships, which said that we need to you need to disclose information in a balanced way with somebody else to build a relationship. So if I would just meet you, I would maybe introduce myself, you introduce yourself, and we would gradually disclose ever more intimate information in a very bidirectional and balanced way. And social media completely tore up that rule book. Like for many PhD students, my first 2 years were a complete and utter failure. I tried to do get a collaboration set up with Facebook, but this was a time of Cambridge Analytica, and the legal parts of that were kind of impossible obstacles to overcome. And so I decided to take a break, go to Germany and visit a university there. And at that time, this article came out. So this is an article written by Professor Jean Twenge, who was at the time promoting her book, iGen, that has just come out. So this is, September, October 2017. And this article in The Atlantic actually was the most successful science article in The Atlantic that year. It went absolutely viral. I felt like everybody was reading it, left, right, and center. It was being discussed, by really everyone in the media, in policy, in academia. And this article really struck a nerve. It talked about how smartphones were probably leading to a decrease in mental health in the current generation of adolescents. And I've pasted a paragraph here. What Jean Twenge argued was psychologically, the current generation of adolescents are more vulnerable than millennials were. Rates of teen depression and suicide have skyrocketed since 2011. It's not an exaggeration to describe iGen as being on the brink of the worst mental health crisis in decades. Much of this deterioration can be traced to their phones. So as researchers, I think that last sentence should really catch our eye. It's a pretty causal statement about how this mental health crisis can be traced to phones or to be blamed on phones. And, all of these things were happening and people were and still are concerned. This is data from the US, on the major incidence of depression that has been rising in adolescence from about 2010 onwards. There's still a lot of debate about, is this a real trend? What is driving it? And kind of how big are these changes? But I think especially now with the recent report by the US Surgeon General that also looked at suicide rates and much broader statistics, we can say that there has been a decrease in adolescent mental health that, I'm funded by the Medical Research Council here in the UK, that, we need to understand. At the same time, digitalization of childhood has massively increased. And this is just weekly internet use now from the UK data, but this has occurred across the board. In the US, the Pew Research Center has amazing data showing that in 2014, about 25% of young people were online almost constantly. And then in 2018, that was 50%. And we can all probably guess where this is now, during the pandemic or in 2022. It's probably a lot higher. So as humans, we're quite prone to then see kind of connections between different trends, especially if they relate to technology, because we see technology as real driving forces in society, something called technological determinism. I've written quite extensively about this. I can't cover this here today, but I do have a YouTube channel with only one video, which is me giving a lecture on why we're so kind of, as humans, so prone to make these connections. So if you're interested, do have a look. So going back to this article, there's no surprise why this hit a nerve. It's blaming technology about something we really care about, which is the health of our young people. And it's blaming it on something quite simple, it's phones. And in the article, I think there were things like, we're all using phones as our alarm clock, they're kind of everywhere. But I, as somebody again who was kind of being talked about, I was about a month or two off the actual definition of this generation that Jean Twenge used. I felt like, again, it was an oversimplification of the diversity and nuance of use that young people were experiencing. Yes, technology might be bad, but technology is also good. I use it to do advocacy or activism, and I still use my phones to do everything from sport to calling my grandma to scrolling through social media. So I ended up tweeting a bit about this to very few followers, and it snowballed into me writing things for The Guardian and even debating Jean Twenge live on air, not live, on air on Radio 4, which is like our equivalent to NPR, if that's the right way of doing the acronym, for 14 minutes. So as a PhD student, I decided, what, I'm going to pivot towards this. This is way more interesting and people seem to be interested. And I'll actually have a look at the data. So I'm a failed physicist. I was admitted to undergrad as a physicist and never graduated as one. So going into data sets that were already available, these are large scale, secondary or epidemiological data sets, felt quite natural. And this is something like what I found. So this is in a Medium article I wrote at the time, where I started looking at this data set that was driving this article. And on the x-axis, you have social media use in adolescence. And on the y-axis, you have depressive symptoms. I'm pretty sure this is the MTF data set. So this is probably 6-figure digits of amount of adolescents that are being surveyed. And while the blue line of best fit seems quite flat, it's actually a statistically significant positive correlation between social media use and depressive symptoms because of this really high statistical power. And speaking at a school of public health, I don't really need to talk about some of these issues with using large-scale data sets without really thinking about effect sizes, statistical power, etc. But definitely in my area, we do need to go through these basics, that while low power is an issue, really high statistical power also means that you'll start, you have such a powerful microscope, you'll start seeing really tiny things become statistically significant. Furthermore, in these large secondary data sets, we often don't have the perfect measurement of things. These are designed to answer thousands of different research questions that governments and scientists are interested in. And so, the measurements we have are often not ideal, or there are multiple different questions that could be used to answer, to measure the same construct. And so in the data sets that had been looked at, there had been quite a lot of flexibility of, for example, how to define well-being. So this is just a kind of explanatory graphic, but on the y-axis, all the columns are different questions to do with well-being that could be found in this data set. So for example, I take a positive attitude towards myself, or how happy are you these days? And I reviewed parts of the literature that had just been published using this data set, and almost every single study used a different combination of questions to measure a well-being related construct. So we have very high kind of ability to be flexible in how we analyze data, and we have this extremely high power, which means that even very small effect sizes become statistically significant. And this may start to make me feel like a lot of these data sets are too big to fail. If we have a certain predisposition about what we might find, just this flexibility and this power could make us find quite, statistically significant effects that might not be more than kind of noise. And so I wanted to investigate this further. And this was then kind of the first big output of my PhD, where working with my colleague at Oxford, Andrew Shabilsky, I analyzed 3 different data sets, the YRBSS, Monitoring the Future, and the UK Millennium Cohort Study. And I wanted to show how this flexibility in large-scale data might be problematic. So most often when we analyze data, we could actually analyze that data in many different ways. It's something that Andrew Gelman calls the garden of forking paths. For example, we need to make decisions about what control variables to include, how we define our X and Y variable, if we exclude certain outliers or not. Do we correct for non-linearity or non-normality? And so all of these decisions, often it's actually quite difficult to know whether they're right or not. So if we analyze the data while making those decisions and try out different ways of analyzing the data, we might go down a specific path in this garden and get a specific result and feel like looking back, all of these decisions make sense. But actually, there were a lot of other ways we could have analyzed the data that might have given us very different results. And our predispositions, if we don't, for example, register the way we analyze our data beforehand, can allow us to wander down a specific path because it's working better for us. So the way I wanted to address this, to just show that we need to be really careful when analyzing these data, was a method called specification curve analysis. So specification curve analysis was becoming, was being written about quite a bit at the time under that name, or under the name of multiverse analysis, or people were just running multiple analyses at once because they couldn't decide which one was best. And more or less, this allows us to understand, in this world of all of these are theoretically defensible analyses, they would probably all be publishable. Where do on average, where do these effects lie? So I analyzed purely correlational data, so we're looking at associations. But the output were graphs like this. I've simplified this here, and this is just one of the data sets. But on the x-axis is something called specification. So each specification is a different way of analyzing the data. So each unit on that x-axis is a different analytical pathway that was used. So for example, what control variables were included, or how we defined well-being or digital technology use. On the y-axis, you have the more or less the correlation between well-being and digital technology use in the data set. So what we can see is that there was about 10,000 ways of analyzing this data, which found a statistically significant negative correlation between the two. But there were also 5,000 ways of analyzing the data to find a statistically significant positive relation, or 5,000 ways that would have found a non-significant negative correlation. On average, which is the dotted line, it was statistically significant negative correlation that was very small. This analysis method is a lot more powerful, and for example, you can use it to look at what choice biased things in certain directions, but I don't have time to talk about this today, so do have a look at the paper if you're interested. I then wanted to extend it in different ways. For example, I wrote a paper looking at time use diaries, where instead of just reporting how much digital technologies they used, teenagers wrote down what they were doing every 15 minutes of the day. And so I could look at not just the total time of digital technology use, but also whether it was at night, for example, or not. And we didn't really find a lot more there. Things were quite mixed. And if there was a correlation, it was very small. I'm probably preaching to the choir to say that, you know, this is just correlational data. At the time, that was kind of where we were, but it was necessary to start looking at longitudinal data. So this is what we then brought Tobias Diemen on board, who is now an assistant professor at the University of Vienna, and used the United Kingdom's Understanding Society data set to actually have a first look at these longitudinal links between especially social media use and adolescent life satisfaction. So this was about 12,000 teens between the ages of 10 and 15 who were surveyed annually for 7 years. And this was self-reported social media use and life satisfaction. Using a modeling method called random intercept cross-site panel models, we could actually look at the within-person relationships over time between the links between social media use and life satisfaction. What we found that is if a person uses higher than their own average of social media use in 1 year, that predicted a small decrease in life satisfaction 1 year later. But the opposite was also the case. If a person had lower than average life satisfaction in 1 year, that predicted a small increase in social media use 1 year later. And I think this shows us that the links between social media and life satisfaction are probably very complicated. I would even say, you know, this bidirectional thing is probably an oversimplification. It's probably a complex network of different things, but this was really important as the kind of way of showing that we're dealing with something a lot more complicated. Another way that this is more complicated is that there are a lot of individual differences. So for example, in this project, I started looking at gender differences between male and female groups. And in this graph, you have on the y-axis different aspects of life satisfaction. So satisfaction with schoolwork at the top and appearance at the bottom. And on the x-axis, you have the relationship between social media use predicting life satisfaction 1 year later. And as you can see in this female group, most of these effects these links are statistically significant. So the confidence intervals don't overlap with the zero axis. However, if we now compare that to the male group, we start finding that the effect sizes shrink and a lot of these links become non-significant, showing that there might well be a strong gender difference between the two. Something to note is that we're still kind of extending this work in my group. We know that, for example, while a lot of the adolescents, you know, around the world aren't based in the global north, most of the work and the data sets that are being analyzed have been based in countries like the UK and the US. A recent systematic review that's currently under revisions led by my PhD student, Sakshi Gai, especially has shown that, you know, in the literature linking depression with social media use is heavily skewed towards certain populations. So a lot of what I'm saying is probably only relevant to those that we study. Furthermore, something we've become quite interested in my group is that while we often study things like depression or anxiety and social media use, we often look at community samples, so kind of samples of adolescents in schools, for example. But the link might be very different to those who actually have a diagnosis of, for example, depression or anxiety. So another PhD student, Louisa, is looking into this now. And for example, a data set we're gearing up to analyze from the NHS shows that there are core differences in populations that have a diagnosis of a mental health disorder or don't. So this is the response to a question about whether teens compare themselves to others on social media, classified between genders, and also whether they have a disorder diagnosed by a clinician or they don't. And you can see these kind of very stark trends, especially again in the female group. So overall, over these 5-6 years, the field has really tried very hard to quantify the link between social media use and well-being, gauge its importance, understand directionality and causality with varying degrees of success, and understand these individual differences. There seems to be a lot of heterogeneity there. And I think the consensus is that these are highly heterogeneous links. They really differ in kind of how you use social media and who the users are. They're probably these small bidirectional negative relations, but the real kind of underlying network there is unclear. And I think there is consensus that individual differences really matter, but real theoretical framework to understand what individual differences are key. You know, even me looking at gender, we don't know what the things are that are driving these differences. Is it really gender? Is it social status? Is it the way you interact with the world? And are there more important individual differences that we should look at, for example? And so there's been a lot of work individually looking at different differences and showing that these links are small, they are mixed effects, and we don't, you know, I think it's led to a lot of convoluted results in the landscape. However, in that time, you know, our policy world hasn't stayed still. There's been a lot of interest into how do we give guidance to young people and parents and schools around social media use, but also how do we regulate companies if we want to do that? And this is just some examples from the UK where I gave evidence to various parliamentary committees and the chief medical officer, but more recently, you know, we've had the same with the US Surgeon General, who I've met a couple of times with his team on this question. However, you know, for a long time, my key message was we just don't know enough. You know, the link is small, it's highly heterogeneous. We just don't, we don't know. And this is something that has really been echoed in these reports that have come out at the end, for example, by the chief medical officers in 2019, where they said, you know, we're unable to give a core recommendation for screen time for young people because there's just not enough good quality research. However, I think our policy landscape has now become a bit fed up with this and is moving towards regulation because we just don't have the evidence available. And there's some really great philosophical work on this. You know, technology moves really fast and science doesn't. So where are we left there? And so I started feeling like, you know, I'm a psychologist by training. What can I do to kind of help people on the ground even more than I'm doing now? What can I add to my portfolio to make a bigger difference in a time where we really need evidence? Sorry, let me just have a drink. So at that time, I joined a new department. So I came back to Cambridge, and this is now the department where I also lead my research group. And they do a lot of work in kind of medical fields, whether that's stroke or trauma, and everybody's trying to benefit patients. And the way they do it is that, you know, they try these mechanistic links that, for example, link trauma to certain outcomes so that we can maybe interfere with those? Or for example, with stroke, what are maybe the pathways driving certain outcomes so that we can diagnose those early and give them special treatment? And so I felt like a lot of my work has actually thought about social media use and mental health really superficially without digging deep mechanisms. And if I would do more work looking at mechanisms, maybe we could figure out, on the one hand, are there certain populations that are more sensitive that we could treat differently? But also, are there certain features that could be regulated for certain populations, for example? But I think also to just drive fundamental research, adding these thoughts in my daily life has really changed the way I approach questions. One example has just recently come out a month ago. So when I joined the department at University of Cambridge, I started talking a lot with Professor Sarah Jane Blakemore and Professor Roger Kivitt, who's now in the Netherlands, but they're both developmental psychologists. Sarah Jane is one of the world leading experts on adolescence, especially the brain development, and Roger models cognitive development statistically. And what we felt is that actually, we've known now for many, many years that adolescence is a time of major change, biological, cognitive, social, you say it. A lot of, the changes in adolescence seem to inherently align with, the social media environment. And I'll talk a bit more about this later, well, in the last 10 minutes of my talk. But a lot of my work and also the work of others had kind of lumped adolescence into one big blob. We treat a 10-year-old the same as a 15-year-old, and we didn't really consider that adolescence extends to ages 21, or in some definitions, for example, by the Wellcome Trust, to ages 24. So I became really interested, how does age play a role in the link between social media use and well-being? And the first step was to actually just look at the cross-sectional relations across the lifespan. In this graph, I'll show you social media use on the x-axis and satisfaction with life on the y-axis. And this is now an analysis, again, of the Understanding Society dataset, but across a much larger age range. These analyses are split by sex, with the female sample in the red, the male sample in the blue. Do ask me about this split. There were some participants that, for example, changed their reporting over these 7 waves or refused to answer, which we did have a look at. But I've spent a lot of time with reviewers thinking about this, so I'd love to talk about it more. But what we found in late adolescence was that across the board, there weren't any strong sex differences, but there was this kind of inverse U-shaped relationship, which is sometimes called the Goldilocks hypothesis. Those young people that use the most or the least social media seem to report worse satisfaction with life than the kind of counterparts in the middle. In early and kind of adulthood, the relationships were pretty similar. But the confidence intervals were wider at very high levels of use, because very high levels of use became less frequent, and very high level of use were even more infrequent for 10 and 11-year-olds in people in their 60s and 70s, where we couldn't really interpret these relationships anymore because the error bars are so large. However, at ages 12 to 15, we start seeing quite substantial sex differences, especially with the female group showing this quite negative link that was almost linear, especially at age 14 or 13, for example. So what these cross-sectional results show is, we might be interested in some of these things happening, but again, without longitudinal data, we don't know what the actual processes are underlying those. So the next step was to look at longitudinal data of ages 10 to 21, again, surveyed for 7 years every year. And we looked at whether letting the path from social media use to life satisfaction or vice versa vary between sex and age, whether that allowed the model to fit better or not. What we found was that actually, letting the path from life satisfaction into social media use 1 year later vary across age and sex didn't help the model fit any better. And so higher than average life satisfaction in 1 year did predict a small decrease in social media use 1 year later, but there were no real changes, for example, across the lifespan. However, the other path, so social media use predicting life satisfaction 1 year later, did vary across age and sex. For example, in the male cohort, between ages 10 to 13, there were no statistically significant links. You can see that the error bars are overlapping with 0, but at ages 14 and 15, as well as age 19, the link from social media use to life satisfaction became statistically significant and negative. When we compare that to the female group, we also see these two kind of windows where there is a statistically significant negative link, but the first one is earlier than in the male group, while the second one is at the same time. This gives us some really interesting hypotheses to think about. For example, might those first windows be due to something developmental, for example, associated with puberty, that we know female groups go through earlier, and they also experience some of the social changes earlier, as well as decreases in mental health in adolescence occur earlier for them. And the second one, might that be something social that just happens across the whole population? For example, changes from school to university, work, or further and higher education. So overall, this led me to become really excited about all of this adolescent development and how that might be driving certain, how that overlaps with what social media is providing young people. For example, social media is a really social environment, and social feedback is really crucial as kind of part of the way we use social media. Great cognitive neuroscience papers like the one by Orben et al. In 2017 showed that in young adolescents, the perceived acceptance of strangers, so how much I think I will be accepted by a stranger, decreases quite substantially and then recovers over time. So for those people in this kind of trough of sadness on them feeling judged by others, how might the social media environment be different? So what I think we can do is move away from thinking about social media as the kind of risk factor for mental health, and instead think about, are there risk and resilience factors for mental health, and how does social media impact those? And sorry, I'm just gonna have a look at the chat. Oh, fine. So I think I still have 5 minutes. So I will take those. So the way that me and my colleagues now conceptualize and try to think about how we integrate cognitive neuroscience approaches into this mechanistic questioning of social media use and mental health is that there exist risk and resilience factors like sleep is really important to, is a strong predictor of positive mental health outcomes, or self-esteem, low self-esteem is a strong negative predictor of mental health outcomes. And we need to start thinking about how does social media fit into those. For example, social media might be decreasing the amount of sleep young people experience or have, and then that decreases mental health. Or social media might be decreasing self-esteem, and that might decrease mental health. Just as social media might increase social connectedness for some, and that then increases mental health. However, social media could also work as a moderator. When I was just at Harvard last week, there was a really nice presentation around vulnerable and disadvantaged groups, for example, trans youth, who are often ostracized in the school environment, and where social media might buffer this ostracism by allowing them to connect online. And here, social media might act as a moderator, buffering kind of this ostracism impact on mental health. However, the clinical psychologist in the group, Tim Dalgleish, who works in my department, always says, well, you know, if you start looking at things like this, you might just be studying, do bad things making mental health worse and good things making mental health better. What is the unique thing about social media here? You know, for example, social media showing us distressing content also happened with newspapers or with television or in everyday life. And so I think we need to think about what makes social media distinct. I'll just talk about one of those here. So, for example, one way that social media is distinct is that it makes communication really available, and it allows adolescents to have social communications at any point in the day or the night, allowing this kind of always on nature. And so it is inherently easy to kind of displace time. When we think about this availability and social availability further, thinking about the wealth of knowledge we have about adolescent development, we know that peer interaction becomes really important in adolescence, and also that social acceptance becomes increasingly important in adolescence. So something that Sarah Jane Blakemore has shown multiple times is that young people are often motivated to avoid social risk-taking. And so, for example, there might be a young person at a party who is offered a cigarette, and they know very well what the health risk is a couple of years or decades down the line. But actually, if they refuse the cigarette and so kind of action the health risk, understand the health risk and decide not to take it, they might be taking a social risk. They might be ostracized by their friendship group. They might be labeled as uncool. And for them, it might be that the social risk is actually way more important than the health risk over time. And actually, a lot of work on interventions, thinking about how adolescents weigh up these risks, have been quite successful. So this could be, for example, applied to social media research. If we think about sleep impacting mental health, there's been a lot of kind of worry about social media decreasing sleep. And so there's been a lot of interventions focused on telling young people how important sleep is, and that they should not use social media closer to bed. This is some of the core policy advice that has been given to parents, even without very strong evidence. And this is, I know I'm running out of time, so this is really the last slide. What I think, thinking mechanistically and thinking about this adolescent development and how they weigh up risks, what we can think about is that actually for them at that bedtime deciding to log off, they're weighing up maybe the risk of sleep on their mental health, the lack of sleep, with the social risk of logging off before your friends. And for many of them, Emily Weinstein that I talked to here at Harvard last week, you know, the balance might fall into the social risk, that the social risk is more important, and so I'm going to stay online. So by studying this and actually quantifying these things, is there then a way to create an evidence base where we can design interventions to shift things back? And so I hope this shows that if we think mechanistically and we actually think about adolescence and what we know from a wealth of interdisciplinary knowledge, and try to integrate it into this important work on social media use and mental health, we might actually not just give policy advice on this high level around the average links, but actually give concrete advice around interventions or recommendations that might actually work to help people in the long term. So if you're interested in this sort of mechanistic hacking, my group is always looking for people. So we actually have an RA and a postdoc ad coming very soon. Otherwise, I want to thank my team, as well as my collaborators in Cambridge and my funders. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Amy, thank you so much. That was great. You really covered the waterfront on these issues. I know we are almost out of time, but I do want to ask, maybe combine the questions from Dr. Liu and Dr. Austin into one broader question and see if we can answer that. I think one challenge, which we all discussed, you kept referring to your presence at the other Cambridge. It's at the social media workshop we organized last week, and incidentally, Dr. Cesar Escobar is actually here on the call, so whose study you cited. I'm glad he could join us. So the one question that is coming up is the issue of methods, right? So the issue of exposure. So the first thing we want to know is, what are they actually doing on social media? What is the kind of content they are being exposed to? And then the outcomes, right? As a part of that causal inference. And that, and it is becoming increasingly difficult because social media do collect these data, the platforms, but are making it more and more difficult to share that with us. So I think the question is, how do we study that? How do we, study that kind of exposure versus outcomes, particularly when the technology itself is changing, when they're rapidly changing the elements of features of platforms, whether it's likes or not, whatever it is.
This is a crucial question. I think it's just a big challenge for this field, is how to deal with both the rapid nature of the change and the difficulty of getting access to the right data. So I think we should scream about how difficult this is, especially when we have the ear of policymakers and people thinking about regulation. But naturally, companies don't like sharing their data, especially openly. So I think there are quite a couple of different options that are starting to become more popular. Researchers are installing apps on phones that, for example, track different types of uses over time. Especially there's been a large investment by the Dutch Research Council into data donation infrastructure that allows people to more or less download their own data from social media sites to then give to researchers. All of these have different limitations and strengths, just as some people are getting their participants to take screenshots of their screen time app and then submitting those, or actually going through them and doing a more qualitative evaluation of what they were doing and why. So I think, like in any good research area or challenging research area, is that we need to triangulate different methods that have different limitations and benefits. And so I think seeing the wealth of different approaches that are emerging is really, really great, because I think we'll need every one of those to paint that picture. What I do will only be part of a much bigger endeavor to understand technological impacts.
Thank you. In fact, some of your work, especially the most recent publication, also offers some good pointers, at least for practice, if not for policy. Policy may be premature and too early, but from practice perspective, I think your work certainly provides some direction, because there is a lot of hunger out there from parents and other practitioners about what to do. So thank you so much. We are almost out of time. People will start going to classes. So this was absolutely fascinating. We'll continue to watch your work and follow your work. So thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. Please log on to our website. We will continue to post future events. We will continue this series on social media and well-being. Thanks again, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Amy.